Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. I know you can't see each other, but we can see you. We've got a great audience out there and are going to get started with today's webinar. My name is Joe Short. I serve as the Vice President at the Northern Forest Center. And again, thank you for being with us today. The center is a regional not-for-profit organization. We work across the expansive Northern Forest region, the immense forest spanning Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and New York. And all of our work and our mission is focused on creating a vibrant future for this place, which includes a healthy forest, thriving rural communities, and vibrant forest-based businesses. This webinar is part of our Building the New Forest Future webinar series, which we've designed to amplify stories, practices, and lessons from community development, sustainable tourism, forest economy, and other topics that are shared across the 4 Northern Forest states. Our goal in today's webinar is to present and discuss an objective overview of some of the federal policy issues in play currently that have real or potential impacts on forest management, forest health, and forest industry in the Northern Forest region. Why does this matter? Well, the Northern Forest spans 26 million acres. We sit in several of the most forested states in the country. We have a mix of private, state, tribal, and federally owned forest lands, and we have rural economies and particularly around the forest product production and recreation and tourism that are tightly tied to the forest. And federal policies and programs are relevant across all of these issues. And as I'm sure we are all well aware, this is a dynamic time in federal policy. So today's conversation feels important to have. I'll note that there are, of course, many other federal policy decisions and discussions with impacts for our region and issues like healthcare, for example, on many others. But today we're really focused on policies that have a direct impact on forests, forest health, and forest-based industry. We've got a really great and knowledgeable group with us today, and we're going to start with a conversation amongst our panel before turning to your questions. For questions, please use the question and answer feature. That's an extra button in your Zoom bar at the bottom to type in your questions. We prefer that to chat. Please, helps us keep track of those. We'll try to weave in questions as we go, but we will also have a good amount of time at the end of our panel discussion to pick up your questions. So before we jump in, and as both a primer and a bit of a structure for our conversation today, I want to touch on 5 primary levers for federal policy change that are going to flow through our day today. And to my colleague Kendall, I know we were having a challenge with the slides, but if you're able to get that one up, go for it. But if not, that's okay. So the first area are executive branch actions. These are things like executive orders, trade policy and tariffs, and administrative actions. So that's one way that federal policy and programs can change. Second, budget and fiscal policy legislation. The One Big Beautiful Bill, which passed earlier this year, is an example of that type of policy lever. Third, every year the president provides their discretionary budget proposal. President Trump put his into the world in early May, outlining the president's ideas, budget requests, or appropriations requests, excuse me, for discretionary programs in the coming fiscal year. Congress, which is the one who writes and passes the appropriations bill, starts with the president's request sometimes, but often develops things that look entirely different in the form of appropriations bills, which are in theory passed and signed into law by September 30th of each year, the end of the federal fiscal year. But in reality, often don't get done, leading or are passed in things called minibuses or omnibuses, or sometimes don't get passed and go into something called a continuing resolution. So that is a big area, annual appropriations, where decisions are made that affect a lot of programs that I'm guessing many of us are familiar with. And finally, there is the category of standalone legislation, so bills that are focused on specific topics that are, of course, proposed very frequently, much more rarely passed, but that is a fifth lever. So we offer those both as a framework. We're going to use these categories as we go through our discussion today. But for those who probably, fortunately, are not thinking about federal policy every day, just a reminder on how things work and different ways that policy gets made. So let's jump in. Really thrilled with the group that we have here today. I can't promise that we collectively know everything about federal policy as it relates to forests, but this is a great brain trust of folks. So I'd like to welcome Mandy Warner, who's the Senior Policy Director with the Appalachian Mountain Club, Danielle or Danny Fitzko, who's the Commissioner with Vermont Department of Forest Parks and Recreation, Stephen Roberge, who's the Extension Forestry Specialist and a professor with the University of New Hampshire Cooperative Extension, and Dana Doran, who's the Executive Director of the Professional Logging Contractors of the Northeast. So to get into our conversation, I'm going to ask each of our panelists just to provide a quick introduction to themselves, who you are, your role, where you're based, and just your quick sense of how does your work have you intersecting with federal programs and policy around forests. So Mandy, let's start with you.
Thanks so much, Joe, and good afternoon to everyone. And thank you to the Northern Forest Center for hosting this important discussion today. My name is Mandy Warner. I am the Senior Director for Policy for the Appalachian Mountain Club. I have been in this role since May of this year and am based in Fairfax, Virginia. For folks who aren't aware, Appalachian Mountain Club is the oldest conservation and recreation organization in the country. We've got close to 90,000 members from Maine to Virginia. Our mission is really to foster the protection, enjoyment, and understanding of the outdoors and providing access across the entire region. We also work closely with the U.S. Forest Service. We work in the White Mountain National Forest in New Hampshire. We have been operating a special use permit to provide public services and overnight experiences. We work on trails and facilitate recreation activities and also conduct scientific research and monitoring. We also have about 130,000 acres of forested lands that we are managing in northern Maine. We're focused on restoring late successional conditions in that area through a combination of reserves and conservative timber management. I lead the policy team for AMC. We work at the local, state, and federal level to advance policies that promote conservation, outdoor recreation, and access. The way that AMC really intersects with federal forest policy is that we're working to ensure that all policies adopted by the administration, by Congress, are reflecting the really diverse benefits and values of forest in all of their decision-making and management. That includes the ecosystem benefits, the cultural and economic values for communities near these facilities and near these resources. So we're working on promoting policies that advance ecological integrity and support appropriate recreational uses. And that's really taken the form of looking at regulatory policies, which we've had quite a few coming out this year. We've had a lot of conversation on federal funding of programs, and then there's a lot of individual pieces of legislation that's moving. So all really relevant for AMC's mission.
Great. Thank you, Mandy, and thanks for being here. Danny, let's go to you next.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Danny Fitzko. I'm the Commissioner of the Vermont Department of Forest Parks and Recreation. On this panel, I'll be representing the voices of state agencies in the region, clearly with a focus on Vermont. For a little bit of background, I'll give you kind of the scope of the work that I support. I support our state park systems, conservation, recreation, state lands, and then our forestry programs, which are broad from urban and community forestry, forest economy, watershed forestry, forest health, wildland fire, and private land stewardship. The forestry programs that we deliver are in partnership with the U.S. Forest Service, state, private, and tribal forestry. Huge and long-standing partnership that we rely on. I mainly follow what's going on the federal scene through our partnership with the National Association of State Foresters. Normally, Oliver Pearson, who's our state forester and director of forests, would be the one representing this voice today. But he, along with several other state foresters, are roughing it right now at the national meeting in Hawaii. When I think about sort of the scale and the scope of what state forestry agencies do, it's expansive, from our work to conserve, protect, and enhance forests really touches 2/3 of America's forests. I come today to panel discussion talking about what we know, what we sort of have been through already, what we're watching, and how that can impact state service delivery. So I look forward to chatting with you.
Thank you, Danny. And yes, for the record, we reached out to all 4 state foresters, all of whom were busy today. So Danny, thank you so much for stepping up and joining us. So let's jump the river to New Hampshire and Steve.
Yeah, thanks, Joe and Kendall, for having us today and in the Northern Forest Center. My name is Steve Roberge. I'm the State Extension Forester for UNH Cooperative Extension. I oversee the County Forester Program here in New Hampshire, and that program serves to provide education and outreach to private forest landowners. So everything from soup to nuts, when we talk about with landowners, anything you can do in the woods, we have conversation about and support them with management, stewardship, conservation of their land. Woven into the work that we do is a 100-year-old agreement with the New Hampshire Division of Forest and Lands, where we are the entity working with private forest landowners here in the state. Through that MOU, we actually administer the U.S. Forest Service's Forest Stewardship Program. Pretty unique in the nation, actually, where Cooperative Extension does that programming instead of a state agency. So we are hand in hand with state, private, and tribal forestry through the Forest Service, work very closely with those partners. At the same time, working very closely with the USDA's NRCS programming as well, where we have a long-standing agreement with them to deliver education about their programs, help with technical assistance, and lay out our practices on New Hampshire forest lands. Along with landowner assistance and programs and education that we provide here in New Hampshire, we actually work pretty closely with our region's research forests that we have here. So if you're in New Hampshire, you know that there's Hubbard Brook and also the Bartlett Experimental Forest. In Maine, we have the Massabesic and also Penobscot. All 4 of those forests represent 4 different forest types that are very important to our silvicultural knowledge, the way we manage our forests, and the way that we educate our workforce on how to steward the forest into the future. So having a close relationship with those experimental forests is key to my role as an educator, and the knowledge that we know how to manage our forests for the most part has come out of those landscapes. And so those are near and dear to my heart, and paying very close attention to what happens on those as we move forward.
Great. Thank you, Steve. And Dana, take us home.
Terrific. Thank you, Joe, and thanks, Kendall and the center for hosting us today. Glad everyone could join us this afternoon. So my name is Dana Doran. I'm Executive Director of the Professional Logging Contractors of the Northeast. We're an educational association that represents timber harvesting and hauling businesses throughout the Northeastern United States. We've got members in Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and New York. Our organization started back in 1995 in the state of Maine, and today we have about 250 contractor members who harvest and haul forest products throughout the Northeastern United States. We do a multitude of different things, including advocacy, training for our members. We have an insurance program, discount purchasing program, and a philanthropic program called Log a Load for Kids that raises money for 3 children's hospitals in the Northeast that we're very proud of. Over the last 30 years, we've raised about $3 million for children's hospitals. So where our organization gets involved with federal policy is in a multitude of ways, but most directly, our members are the boots on the ground on federal forest timber sales. They're the ones who are actually building roads, harvesting and hauling forest products from federal timberlands. But we also are acutely involved with federal policy having to do with transportation and also forest regulations and how they intersect and impact with our member small businesses. Our members are as small as 1 sole proprietor-based businesses to multi-service, diversified forest trucking and hauling businesses that have up to 100 employees and all points in between. The average size of one of our members is about 8 employees. So they're all small family-based businesses that tend to transcend generation to generation, but they're the ones who are making the key decisions on the ground. They're the ones who are harvesting the wood and the ones who are hauling the wood to various mills throughout the Northeast and into Eastern Canada. And so federal policy has a big impact, whether that is what happens on national forests, or what happens with transportation or environmental protection, et cetera, et cetera. So we play a very close eye on federal policy and how it's going to impact the timber harvesting and hauling industry in the Northeast. So again, appreciate the opportunity to be here today.
Great, thank you, Dana. And I do want to acknowledge my invisible here, but not to us, colleague Kendall Gray, who's behind the scenes on our webinar today, been instrumental in putting this together. I also want to note a perspective that we've certainly been thinking about in today's conversation, but don't have represented, which are federal employees. We're going to be talking a lot about federal agencies. The Forest Service, USDA, NRCS have already been mentioned. But obviously, they're not able to be in a position talking about the policy. So, but I just want to acknowledge that there are certainly a lot of perspectives there that we don't have. But as I said, hopefully you've seen in the introductions from our group perspectives from industry about landowner assistance programs, research, state, private, tribal forestry, conservation, and open space. So as I noted, I don't think we can cover probably everything. I know we've got some real policy experts in the audience. But I think we can I know we're going to have a great conversation and cover a lot of topics in an informative way. So let's start at the high level. We're going to start kind of high, with a conversation just about, big picture, what each of us has been thinking about in the realm of federal policy. And then we're going to drill a little bit deeper in a next question on specific bills and actions. But starting at a high level, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to comment on a couple, and I know that may be challenging, but a few of the top federal policy issues that you've been focused on since President Trump and a new Congress took office in January. So what are a couple of those, and why do you offer that those are issues that are relevant to the Northern Forest region? Let's flow in the same order. So we'll start with Mandy.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. So we have been focused on really protecting some of the longstanding bipartisan investment and policies that have impacts for management of forests in the Northern Forest region. So it's really included two main buckets of work. The first is appropriations and federal funding. That's occupied a lot of energy and time in DC and beyond this year as it relates to, actual direct program cuts and staffing cuts at agencies we work with and depend on, like the U.S. Forest Service. There's been some issues with, rescinding some cuts from the Inflation Reduction Act and the One Big Bill. There's been impacts to scientific research really across the board, but a lot of that with direct impacts for the Northern Forest region. There's also been other, bigger policy issues that have come up in the context of appropriations and funding, like public land sales that we've been engaged in. The second big bucket is like those direct federal policy changes that we're starting to see come out from the agencies and from executive orders that impact either the ecological integrity of the forest or the ability of the government, in our view, to be able to continue to effectively lead the management and partnership that we need to promote science-based policies in our forests. Just a few examples of those types of policies. One is the implementation of the Great American Outdoors Act. This was a landmark piece of legislation adopted in the first Trump administration, governing Land Water Conservation Fund and the Legacy Restoration Fund. We've seen this administration, try to pull LWCF dollars to uses that it's not really intended for. So we've been spending a lot of our time thinking about the implementation side of that, and also with Congress too. The roadless rule, which was mentioned earlier, like that's a live comment period this week. That's going to reverse decades of forest management practices. So AMC has been tracking and engaging in that process. Individual agencies have come out with reorganization and staff capacity change recommendations, including USDA and U.S. Forest Service that we and many others filed comments on last month. There's also like a suite of regulations at the Environmental Protection Agency that AMC is interested in because of what it does to promote reductions in air pollution and climate change, particularly relevant for the Northern Forest, since the Northeast has been kind of the tailpipe of pollution for so long, and we've made pretty tremendous strides in cutting pollution across the board. But we're seeing some policy changes underway now at EPA. There's also a DOI secretarial order that dropped just earlier this month that reinstates a litany of restrictions on LWCF projects that we're focused on right now as well. And all of these kind of together are really impacting how we think about the investment, management, resilience, and access for the Northern Forest. So those are kind of the big high-level issues that we've been most focused on to date.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mandy. And you said it, but just I'll play a bit of the acronym glossary as we go. LWCF, Land and Water Conservation Fund. Yeah, as you said, Mandy, one of those really long-standing programs, I know with tremendous relevance through its funding and also forest legacy to our corner of the country and nationally. Great. Thank you for that. Danny, let's come to you next. What are some of the issues that that you and your colleagues have been focused on?
Sure. As I mentioned in my intro, I'm primarily going to focus on state, private, and tribal forestry, one of the three branches in the Forest Service. State agencies for over a century have been asked to implement national forest policy, most notably through the Cooperative Forestry Assistance Act in 1978. And in order for us to do that, we have to have a robust partnership with the Forest Service, and funding is key to deliver those programs. So I'll start, like, that's probably one of the biggest things that we've been focused on. It's been a roller coaster for the past 9 months, to be quite honest. Early on, I think in February, we were already starting to think about what staff reductions would look like. I will say now things are looking a little better, and Congress has certainly sees the value of the programming. But it started with the continuous resolution. In the continuous resolution, there was a clause that the administration could determine how they would implement that budget. And early on, they were talking about what they were calling pocket rescissions, and we were concerned that we really wouldn't see any of our funds coming to us that we already thought would be coming to us. So that alone was just really nerve-wracking. But now all those grants are either signed or moving. Then it went on to, and I think Mandy already mentioned it, there was IRA, Inflation Reduction Act funds that we had received, and we're worried about those. And we had to wait and pause on those until we would understand if they aligned with President's policy. So waited on those. Those have all moved, at least in Vermont, for us. So that was sort of the first hurdle that we went through. Then there was the big, beautiful bill. And I think Mandy mentioned this as well, that there were some unobligated balances in forest legacy and in forest stewardship, about $100 million that were pulled back. So we were watching that, unfortunately. I think, reconciliation to the big, beautiful bill, Act 1, I think we can expect to see an Act 2, which would need to happen before the end of the federal fiscal year, which would be September 30th. Then we went to the skinny budget, which you talked the president's budget, and no surprise, on May 5th, it was completely zeroed out for state and private forestry, which is absolutely was devastating to many of us, but I think we expected it. To give you a little context of what that could mean, that's critical support for forest health and habitat restoration, wildfire preparedness and response, community forestry, and our work that Steve leads a lot in New Hampshire, our private lands work. The good thing is that it's in Congress's hands now, and they really do see the value of this important work. And we're seeing strong numbers coming out of both the House and the Senate right now, if not level funded, up in pretty much all of our state and private forestry programming, which is great. I could get into a little bit more of the details, but I think we're going to have a deeper conversation later about funding, so I'll pause on that. A few other areas that we're also looking at is the consolidation of wildland fire service delivery under one sort of agency. Secretary Rollins put out a memorandum yesterday that's trying to provide a little bit more details. We're watching that closely. In order for us to prepare and respond to wildland fire, state agencies need to have strong partnerships and be at the table. It looks like they're calling for the reorg to happen in April 2026, and so we'll be watching that to stay engaged in that. We're also watching the Farm Bill closely. A lot of provisions were passed in the big, beautiful bill, but they still need to codify an updated Farm Bill. So there's definitely some forestry titles in there that we'll be looking at. And then our partnership is not all about funding, it's about the people. So we're watching the reorganizations and the impacts on staffing.
Thank you, Danny. Yeah, there's a lot there, and I will say I know the center was another organization that spoke up about the importance of state and private forestry. I think many of us know this, but private lands dominate the northern forest landscape. We've got great state federal and tribal lands as well, but roughly on average, we say about 80% of the land across the Northern Forest is privately owned. So those state, private, and tribal programs are really critical. Maybe more so here than in other parts of the country, I'm not sure. And also, of course, fire. I mean, that topic, it feels like dominates a lot of our national discussion about forests. And that unfortunately may be what most of the general public thinks and knows about forests on a regular basis. A massive issue in the western part of our country, and certainly relevant. It's not that it's irrelevant here, but it's not the tail that wags the dog, so to speak, I think, in terms of the issues here in our region. So important to note that is an issue that, where our region, the Northeast, it's important for us to be recognizing how we're a little different, and advocating for solutions that, yes, work in the West, but also are useful here. Great. Let's go next to Steve and hear about some of the topics you've been most focused on.
Yeah, I think Danny and I have a lot of overlap in terms of things that we're looking for and concerned about. Just to touch on the final point you made in terms of people and staffing with our partners, I totally agree that it's the relationships between the federal, state, and local agencies that really make us kind of do the work that we do. And I think a lot of our states are pretty small here as well as at limited capacity. So having these people on board and the willingness to maybe go out of their lane a little bit to help out and do different things makes a big difference in our small sector here. So I'm paying very close attention to staffing at the Forest Service, especially in the Durham office, where I'm kind of located, and also how that impacts our programming for outreach as well. Because a lot of those folks we would use in our education for landowners and for training for professionals, those folks aren't around anymore. They've either retired or gone, and so that makes bringing those local bringing that expertise to our local landowners even that much more difficult. And so that's a big void that we have right now. We're just kind of watching, will this be replaced? Will even state, private, tribal be around to provide those services for us? That's a big concern. The farm bill is definitely I'm just kind of waiting to see how that all shakes out, just because that really impacts a lot of the work we do with the NRCS and a lot of forestry work that's out there. The NRCS specifically has gone through some changes, in terms of what they funding and what they can do, and also with staff here in New Hampshire. I think they're down from about 20 full-time equivalents or so. Don't quote me on that, but it was quite a big reduction that we've seen over the past year, and that has direct impact on the work that we do in terms of working with landowners, getting contracts on the ground, and making sure that work that needs to get done out there in the woods can get done. And so with limited capacity and changes in different practices, that's something we're paying close attention to as we need to navigate those changes with landowners when we're working with them. A little bit being just focusing on extension, just looking at funding for things like Smith-Lever funding and the Hatch Act, looking at specific laws that fund extension programming throughout the nation. Those were threatened earlier this year, and funding was restored to those. And so, but those are specific funding models that we're really paying close attention to, because without that, specifically Smith-Lever funding, extension nationwide has a hard time existing. And so, so that has implications for forestry here in the Northeast, but also agriculture too.
Yeah.
And then finally, I'll just go back to look at the experimental forests here in the Northeast, and just reiterate how important those are, specifically the ones that need Forest Service staff to be managing the experiments that happen there. Hubbard Brook has a robust staff there. They have a lot of research that's kind of ongoing and happening that's outside the Forest Service. Places like Massabesic or Bartlett, without Forest Service staff kind of leading the charge to make sure that landscape is continually managed, there's over 80 years of continuous monitoring, management, and experiments that have been happening on those forests, Bartlett specifically, that without the leadership or the personnel in place, that just goes away, and we can't just start that over again. It takes, and in the case of the Bartlett, the monitoring that's been going on there, rivals the forestry experiments that have been happening in Europe. There's nothing else in the United States that has that longevity of experimental forest. And so it's very personal to me for that, but it's also very important, I think, for the foresters and land managers here in New England.
Yep. Thanks, Steve. Yeah, and as someone just chimed in on this, but I learned something, the Smith-Lever Hatch Act, a great example of something that may not be widely known, but as you say, is really important. And yeah, I mean, both you and Danny have mentioned the Farm Bill, which I think a lot of us struggle. It's a bit of a misnomer, right? Yes, it's about farms and agricultural policy and commodity policy, but there's also a conservation title there, a forestry title there, a rural development title there, and others that are highly relevant. That's where many of the programs we're talking about are authorized. So absolutely a key thing to be keeping our eyes on. And then, of course, the importance of both the staff and the program funding. I think that's a really important thing to remember, that one thing, hopefully we get, some good news and programs in terms of getting appropriations from Congress, but there need to be staff there to implement them. Great. Dana, let's come to you and your perspective on some of the topics you've been most focused on.
Sure. Thanks, Joe, and I appreciate Mandy and Steve and Danny's perspectives. There's clearly is a lot that has transpired, probably 4 years worth in less than 9 months. Probably the best way that we can summarize the last 9 months has been it's been about cage rattling. And to be honest, regardless of opinion of what has transpired, this has probably brought attention to forests more so than any time, probably since Theodore Roosevelt, with respect to national forests. It's probably been over 100 years since there's been this much attention placed upon forests, whether those are privately owned or publicly owned. It's been probably 100 years since we've had this kind of attention on our forest. And good, bad, or indifferent, I think it's an important conversation to come back to these issues, because I think we all believe in our forests. I think from the perspective of our membership, that belief in forests means forest management. It means rural jobs. It means manufacturing. There's so many tangential connections that I think many in the industry have thought have been lost over the last few decades, regardless of administration. Doesn't matter. But I think from the loggers and truckers standpoint, I'll bring up 5 or 6 areas of policy that we have been focused on, both at our level, at a state level or regional level, or even at the federal level with our sister organization, the American Loggers Council. So first, I'll start with trade and tax policy, and we're going to get into more of this a little bit later, I believe. But the big beautiful bill had many pieces in it, having to do with specific business pieces that I think are important. Again, I'm not going to get into those right now. There's been a tremendous amount of tension on the EUDR and whether or not forest products could be exported from the United States to the European Union. Seems like there's been quite a negotiation, and I think it's probably going to maintain status quo for the time being, but certainly that has been a ripe situation with respect to tax to trade policy for sure. There was a lot of indecision that occurred, in January. Pretty much all exports of logs from the United States stopped, and I think that has started to free up, and it's been opened up. But EUDR had a lot to do with that. In addition to trade relationships with China and many other countries. Tariffs clearly have been a topic of conversation, and then duties, especially with our Canadian friends and finished forest products that come back across the border, all kind of fold into that. What probably and again, we're not going to get into this in detail, but one of the big glaring issues that I think comes up with any discussion regarding tariffs and duties and trade policy is mill capacity. The United States does not have enough mill capacity to process more forest products, whether those come from private lands or come from public lands. And I think that is an elephant in the room that has to be dealt with. Frankly, if whether you're going to use tariffs or duties or to squeeze foreign manufacturers, we need more mill capacity in the United States to be able to process forest products. So trade and tax policy, that's a behemoth. We could probably spend hours on that, and I'm not going to do that today. EPA, one of the positives I think in the last month that we've seen has been attention on Tier 4 Tier 4 engines. So the US EPA and the administration actually put out, it wasn't even through executive action, it was just by policy directive of US EPA that Tier 4 engines, which have been mandated by Congress since 2012, effectively, if there's a default sensor in a Tier 4 engine, whether that's in a piece of logging equipment or an over-the-road truck, those engines will shut down until that default error code can get fixed. Effectively, what's going to transpire going forward is no changes in Tier 4 engines, but those default codes are not going to shut the engine down. And I think that's a godsend for loggers and truckers who effectively can have their equipment shut down for days, if not weeks, until they can get that default code taken care of. So that's a big deal when it comes to the logging and trucking community. We've seen a plethora of changes, whether it's by executive action or other, on national forest land management, timber sales, the roadless rule, that all plays a part. Certainly there's a dichotomy or a difference of opinion of management of forest lands. We believe those forest lands should be managed. There's been tremendous attention from federal lawsuits and NEPA rules. And again, we won't get into that now, but trying to free up those timber sales and not allowing just a simple court case to delay timber sales, I think is going to change the dynamic in terms of management. There's a renewed attention on use of biomass in the country. The big beautiful bill made really no changes in tax policy with respect to biomass. It did make major changes on other renewables. And so the renewable fuel standard is also part of that conversation with the US EPA. And there's a rulemaking that's open right now with respect to the treatment of low value wood and low grade wood as being treated equal under the renewable fuel standard. And then lastly, workforce development is still an issue that we're paying close attention to. There's a piece of legislation that's been in Congress for over a decade now called Youth in Logging Careers that will make the kids of logging company owners equal with their farming counterparts. If nobody knows this, if you're 16 and 17 years old and you're the son or daughter of a farmer, you can operate farming equipment legally. You can run a tractor, etc. For logging, you can't do that. So we've been trying to get this changed for over a decade now. So we want to see that happen. And then lastly, the Loggers Economic Assistance Act, which was introduced by Senator King, Collins, Congressman Golden, Congressman Pingree. It's been co-sponsored by Peter Welch from Vermont. Will make a big difference because of natural disasters and how the logging community is treated during those natural disasters. So I think that's a mouthful. I'll stop there, Joe. We want to talk about other things, or at least get into more detail.
That's great, Dana. One, can you help with the EUDR acronym?
Yeah, it's the European Union Deforestation Regulation.
Okay, great. We'll let folks Google that if they want to get more into it, but thank you for that. And yeah, and Dana, I appreciate that framing, however we might look at it, these issues are more in the headlines. So this is I look at that as an opportunity, right? We may not, I'm sure we don't all agree on the outcomes and the reasons behind some of what's being proposed. And the fact that there is conversation about forests, there is conversation about the agencies that steward our forests and support private landowners in doing that. Dana, about the logging sector and how it works and some of the challenges it's facing. Those can be opportunities as well to at least have the conversation. So maybe that's a little spin, but I think it's helpful as we all look at this. Yes, a flood of changes and suggestions that can be really hard to keep track of, to think about, okay, well, this can also be a moment to advance some things. I hope everyone's hanging in out there. There is a lot of material. As you can tell, there's there's a lot, right? So thank you to our panelists for that overview. And now we are going to dig a little bit deeper. Ask each of our guests here back to the 5 categories that I shared earlier of executive actions, fiscal policy like the big beautiful bill, the president's budget proposal and appropriations, trade policy and tariffs and new legislation. I want to ask each of our panelists to share or not each, but we're just going to go through each of those buckets and just dig a little bit deeper on some of the things that I think have already been mentioned, just to get hopefully provide you with a sense of these are how some of these tools are being used and where some of these proposals live, so that if you're interested in following them, you know where to look. So let's start with executive actions, which again, these are things like executive orders, the power of the executive branch to manage federal agencies and make decisions about how they're structured and run. Again, I'm just going to open this up and let folks jump in. Again, we're not going to hear from everyone on each topic, but on executive actions, who'd like to comment on a few in particular you'd point our audience to with relevance to our region and forests?
Joe, I can start if you want.
Yeah, go for it, Dana. Thank you.
So, really, I felt like were important executive actions that were published. I think it was early February, mid-February, was attention on federal forest land and harvesting on federal forest land that the administration was effectively trying to put in place an action that would open up federal forest land for further harvesting. That has led to some changes in the Big Beautiful Bill, which we'll talk a little later about. There's we're not going to get into it, probably get into it today either, but the Federal Fix Our Forests Act certainly brought kind of was perfectly timed after that because of the attention that was brought by that first executive action. The second executive action, so there were two executive actions published on a Saturday. I remember it distinctly, one having to do with federal forest lands, but the other was importation of forest products from foreign countries and whether or not the United States was at a disadvantage, and there were supposed to be investigations, et cetera. I'm not necessarily sure that those investigations have actually taken place, but it certainly was kind of a punch you in the nose moment to say this administration is going to do things differently. We want to see forest products manufactured in the United States. We believe that the Americans use them every day, and if they're going to use them every day, they should at least come from our forests, whether that's private or public. With respect to trade investigations, there has been, because of the softwood lumber agreement dating back several decades in the United States, those trade discrepancies, especially with our partners in the North and Canada, have been kind of not fodder. They've actually been judiciously reviewed in international trade court that the Canadians have distinct manufacturing advantages, and therefore there have been duties that have been put in place since the softwood lumber agreement expired in 2016. In fact, the International Trade Court doubled the duties about a month and a half ago, and those will continue, and those have nothing to do with tariffs. They're trade investigations that have gone through a court system, and they're reviewed every single year, mill by mill. But certainly, I think those executive actions served more of bring attention to certain issues, and we've seen policy changes as a result that have transpired since. So those to me kind of set the tone with respect to federal forest management and trade with respect to forest products back in February.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thanks, Dana. Who else would like to comment on executive actions?
Happy to follow up on what we touched on earlier, which is the reorganization of the USDA and how we're watching that pretty closely. The comment period for the reorganization now has been extended to September 30th. So if you didn't know that, you still have time to comment. And as we talked about how important it is to have the connections with the people, some of the things that we're concerned about is losing some capacity in our region, particularly closing down of regional offices, loss of research stations, which is, as Steve mentioned, how critical it is for us to do informed management on the ground. Some concerns also with FIA, Forest Inventory and Analysis, and consolidating that hub in Colorado, and particularly here in the Northeast. Some of our states actually do the on-the-ground forest inventory, so sort of losing that connection to the Forest Service staff is real. And if we just look back, I don't know when it was maybe 2010, maybe a little bit later, there was a relocation of an office from Newtown Square to Milwaukee. And we lost a lot of people. So we're going to be asking people to relocate and we'll probably lose more really dedicated staff. And I put this in the chat, and Steve, you were kind of talking about what we've lost in this region. Region 9 for state private forestry, that's our area, 20 states and DC, lost the most staff from the fork in the road or early retirement, and at 42% of the staff. So it's huge. So then we're going to do another consolidation, and we'll probably lose more staff, and really just want to make sure that we have strong connections here in the region with the technical experts, and that can give us the technical expertise, but also help us deliver the programs. There's a lot of administration work that happens behind the scenes. So we'll be commenting and watching that closely.
Thanks, Danny. I hadn't realized that comment period had been extended, which is great. To our audience, we can include a link to that in the follow-up if you're interested to learn more. But yeah, that the USDA reorganization, the Northern Forest Center commented on that as well, because yeah, as Danny said, it proposed four categories of change: workforce reduction, relocation of DC-based folks to North Carolina, Missouri, Indiana, Colorado, and Utah. None of those feel very close to us here in the Northeast. Reducing, this has come up, reducing or eliminating standalone regional offices like Forest Service and NRCS offices, as well as the research stations that Steve mentioned, and consolidating support functions, including maybe transferring some things like grant making and administration to other agencies. So that's definitely, USDA is a massive agency that spans, I think, virtually everything we've been talking about today. So that feels like it has high relevance to this topic in our region. Mandy, I think you wanted to jump in here, and Steve, maybe you as well.
Yeah, well, yeah, and agree with Danny's assessment on the USDA reorganization. Like we are deeply concerned about that proposal. I think the only additional points I've made, we've touched on a lot of these in our respective remarks in the beginning, but there have been some other administrative implementation challenges that we've been tracking and trying to kind of suss out how to get things moving. So project lists, for example, on the Forest Legacy program, LWCF project list, like there were a lot of delays, and that creates challenges because there's dollars that are being leveraged for those programs, and that uncertainty has led to kind of a chilling effect on some of the investments. We saw some of these, like the FLP list did come out. We're still waiting on others. So that's just something we're going to be watching going forward. Is like, are we going to continue to have these administrative delays in programs that kind of create added and longer term uncertainty for how we and many partners think about forest management and delivering outdoor recreation access services. The other key point, grants is another key piece that we've been tracking here, right? And I think Danny and others have mentioned, like, we've been waiting with bated breath to see if some of our grants would go forward that we had anticipated. AMC was impacted by some of those too. We've had some grants on EV charges and other things that have been kind of held up as well. And we know there's just communities or organizations across the gamut who've really had to kind of grapple with that uncertainty of grants, and some grants have been peeled back.
Yeah, that certainly was a big topic early on and still is. I know there are a couple big regional programs. There was a Tech Hub grant to Maine focused on forest bioproducts. There was a Climate Smart Commodities grant regionally. Those were pulled back. And I know many of us who work on grants have had to do some rewriting and repositioning to reflect this administration's priorities. Steve.
Yeah, I was going to touch on that, Joe. I think kind of three categories with the grants that I've been dealing with, or we face here in New Hampshire. One of them being canceled, either canceled, pulled back, or just paused for a while. And so, in the canceled bucket was a very popular landowner program with extension and our partners, Forest Society, TOA, NRCS, that was actually canceled in that sense. We're really sad to see that one go, and really. Yeah, just sad to see that go. I'll leave it at that. Pulled from New Hampshire was a regional conservation partnership program, RCPP, through NRCS. That was a $10 million grant with partners to actually put those dollars on the ground for NRCS practices in New Hampshire and Maine. That one was pulled from us. And then a couple of projects we've had with the NRCS and also USDA looking at both climate smart forestry and in a separate one, agroforestry across the Northeast. Those were paused, and that both of those have a research component to it and timing. One of them has to do with laying out timber sales, and so you can imagine that pause just throws chaos into the work plan for executing those grants. And so kind of still dealing with the repercussions of those pauses. And we're not the only ones. I'm sure every other state that's represented here could probably share similar stories to that, but that's what we've been facing here in New Hampshire.
Thanks, Steve. So our next category is this really is the one big beautiful bill, the sort of fiscal policy. And this was I have to study up on this every time. This is a budget reconciliation package. So budgets and appropriations get mixed sometimes, but budget bill is really mandatory spending, revenues and tax policy, and also the debt limit. So I know the big beautiful bill has already come up a couple of times. Is there anything anyone would like to add in terms of provisions in that, things you haven't already touched on that you think our audience should know about as relevant to forests in our region?
Well, I could chime in on one piece of it that is actually, in our view, a silver lining, because we definitely had some, reservations and concerns about some of the rescissions that came from the IRA provisions regarding forestry for the non-federal forest landowners, the NEPA review, old growth, urban and community forest programs. But one, key area where we were able to get some bipartisan support was for the Forest Legacy Program. We were able to prevent $100 million being rescinded, which for us was a pretty stark victory. A lot of folks, across the community kind of rallied to get that to demonstrate the value of that program and kind of strip that provision out. So that was like one key, I think, for us, a silver lining for this bill. There were a lot of challenges in it otherwise.
That's great. And again, Forest Legacy, Mandy, that largely focuses on working forests, right? So I think that's really relevant. Actually, I think the Forest Legacy had its origins, if I have my history right, in this part of the country. And, conserving working forests, I think, is something that most people can agree on. So I'm glad that you found that support. Anything else on the beautiful bill? Dana, it looks like you're off mute.
Yeah, I'll just, it's both federal forest management, but also tax policy. And it's important, regardless of individual opinion from a business perspective, there were some pieces in there that are really critical for our community. And I'll just run through them quickly. 100% bonus depreciation was restored. That's important for trucks and trailers that are purchased. Qualified equipment expensing. State and local tax deduction was renewed or continued at $40,000 beginning in 2025. The estate tax was increased to 15 million. I mean, most folks will say, well, that's corporate welfare. Well, there are some logging and trucking businesses that have anywhere from $5 to $10 million worth of equipment. They don't have contracts that are worth that much, but they have equipment that's worth that much. And if they're going to pass that along to the next generation, not facing some type of an estate tax is important. There were new levels that were going to the federal forest land situation. There were new goals for timber harvest on public land. U.S. Forest Service and BLM have to increase production by 25% over 2024 levels. Expanded logging authority. NEPA rules were changed as a result of that. And as I mentioned before, the continuance of investment tax credit for biomass. The one negative was that the residential homeowner credit to put in, whether it's a wood stove, pellet boiler, or wood boiler in your home, was actually eliminated as of December 31st of 2025. And I know there are folks in this region who are working really, really hard to get that put back in place, because I think that's a big deal. If we're going to continue on the commercial side, the residential side should be there as well.
Yep. Thanks, Dana. Those are great examples. What was that, 1,000 pages or more, that bill? So I doubt what you just ticked through took up more than a page in total. But I mean, as you say, really important provisions. And yeah, I just want to acknowledge, because it's come up a couple of times, that this tension point, but I think it just prompts good and important conversation about the drive to. We do use and consume a lot of wood in our country and nationally. We thankfully grow a lot of wood as well. But that tension between, how do we, I'm putting my own opinion in here, but, be more self-reliant while also protecting, environmental integrity. That's an important conversation to be having, and acknowledging that there are different perspectives there. And we're probably never going to get everyone to play happy on that one. It is sort of prompting that important conversation to happen. Anything else on the beautiful bill before we go to appropriations? And again, this is really where a lot of the action is right now, both in the House and the Senate. Again, trying to get appropriations bills together and passed by September 30th is always the goal. I've been doing this for like 20 years. I don't think that hardly ever happens, but we try. So in terms of appropriations, we've talked about this a lot already. For example, Danny, you talked about some positive movement away from the president's proposal to zero out state and private forestry. So again, I'll stick to things that anyone would like to add that haven't come up already in terms of ongoing appropriations negotiations that you're paying attention to and would like to share with our audience.
I'm going to add a few more pieces, particularly I think in the Senate appropriations that are important to this region. Besides state private forestry, which we touched on, and forest legacy is also in there at level funding, and that's because of the American Great Outdoors Act. But Wood Innovations Grant is at both the House and the Senate side is looking at a $10 million boost. And those are grants out to support expanding wood energy markets and promote wood as a sustainable building material. I know a lot of success in this region on getting those grants, so that's a big plus up. Also, I think in this region, we are fortunate to have the Forest Ecosystem Monitoring Cooperative, which does long-term forest monitoring and research. That is also in appropriations to maintain that going forward. Northeast State Research Cooperative, which funds research so we can do our work better on the ground. In the Senate side, that has a $6 million price tag on it right now. So that's a tick up. Of course, we know that there's a long ways to go to get to the end line, but those are looking positive. And also, I've talked a lot about state private forestry, but research and development programs as well was zeroed out, and they're plussed up again in the budgets, which is great. So I'll just offer those as positives, and I doubt we'll see September 30th, and we'll have continuous resolution, but we are used to that.
Thanks, Danny. Anyone else on approps? Okay.
I can.
Oh, great, Mandy. Go ahead.
I can jump in. Yeah, we're tracking a lot of the same programs that Danny already walked through. I think a couple of additional things I'd want to flag is, there's programs that like AmeriCorps that also, have connectivity with AMC and some of the work we do on trails, for example, that, we're tracking those cuts. There's, specific, in addition to the scientific research, there's groups like the Northern Border Regional Commission that was added back in by Congress. The Forest and Rangeland Research Program zeroed out, but added back in. I think the details are going to matter, right? We have, different packages moving at different times to different committees. So we're going to have to really, stay on top of like what the actual implementation is going to look like for these programs. But we've seen some encouraging, putting back things in the budget from the president's marker. For example, like the overall funding request to cut, Forest Service by 65%. I don't think that's where we're going to end up at the end of the day, even if we, get a package across in September 30th, or probably more likely in the fall.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'll just jump in real quick, just to Danny's point too, specifically the wood innovation grants and how important those are to maintaining, the industry ecosystem that we have. I know in New Hampshire, a lot of those grants have gone to upgrades to deal with labor shortages as well. And so we talk about, the problem with labor. These grants are kind of solving a problem by adding some automation to it or just making things a little more efficient. If it's an increase in funding, that's great. And we've been, like Danny said, very successful in capturing some of that money here in the region. And so, that's, all the things that we're talking about is very important for at least maintaining that industry ecosystem that we have here. And it now boils back down to landowners as well, and they're able to do work out there in the woods.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just note on wood innovation. I mean, it's one of the few programs we know about that actually can go to private businesses, which is is fantastic. And also just that theme of innovation, I think, I know everyone on the screen knows this, and I'm guessing most of our audience does. There's a need for new market outlets for wood from our region. So that notion of investing in innovation, and it's not just through the grants program, it's through Forest Service has its own innovation lab, and a whole program really focused on next generation forest products, which I feel like is constantly seeding things, out into the environment. That's really important. I know not just here, but nationally, that notion of what are those next generation products, particularly that use the lower grade, lower value material, whether that's here in the Northeast or in the West, where that's the thinnings for wildfire need those market outlets as well. All right. We're getting towards the end of our list here, and we've talked a lot about trade policy and tariffs already. Dana, is there anything you haven't said already in that regard that you'd like to add? And then Danny, I know you covered the outdoor recreation sector as well, so I know there's some impacts there that I want to come to, but let's start with Dana.
Sure. Thanks, Joe. One of the pieces that I didn't talk about, I think that is, it's out there and folks don't realize it. So with the tariff situation going back as far as January, when tariffs were placed upon steel and imported electronics, that has increased the cost of harvesting equipment by 30% right out of the gate. And I know by talking to equipment manufacturers and equipment dealers, equipment is not moving. One of our supporting members who actually manufactures log trailers has not had one order for a new log trailer in 2025. And it's due to what has been created is one, increase in cost because of steel. But number two, there's just so much uncertainty and fear from the logging community about what's happening with markets. They can't reinvest. Are they going to be able to sell their wood? Should they be making the investments? So they're literally holding on to their equipment. Only recently have we seen a few pieces move in the Northeast, but still, this is probably going to be the worst year ever for equipment sales because of the situation that has been created. So I think that's a real negative that has been created on the tariff kind of trade policy. I mentioned it before. We saw a huge amount of wood cross the border into Canada from, let's say, January through March. I think the Canadians saw an opportunity to try to get ahead of whatever would happen potentially with tariffs on top of the duties. And so they really ramped up manufacturing. That's been kind of a godsend for timber harvesters in the Northeast because they needed places to move wood. What has transpired over the last 2 years is that with increased interest rates, building construction has really faded off. And so there's really been a big challenge of moving solid wood products and roundwood. The Canadians ramped up manufacturing to get ahead of those tariffs. They stockpiled lumber. They moved lumber into the U.S. market and put it in warehouses to try to get ahead of it. We haven't seen, because of the USMCA, the trade agreement that was signed back in 2020 by the then Trump administration. Tariffs are not going to come into play on finished forest products that are coming into the United States from Canada. The duties will continue, but I think it does, and I brought it up before, the fact of the matter is we don't have U.S. manufacturing. We don't have enough U.S. manufacturing. That's the elephant in the room. Until we get serious about our own tax policy, about incentives for manufacturing. I had a conversation with someone a few months ago about, the attention upon U.S. manufacturing. The auto industry got really serious about 20 years ago with respect to increasing of manufacturing because of the fear of not buying foreign automobiles. We need to get serious to have U.S. manufacturing of forest products in the United States. And until we do, we're still going to be reliant upon foreign markets.
Thank you, Dana. Danny, so as we mentioned, I'll just tee you up here. You're the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. So that's an aspect we know of trade policy and tariffs that has also come to bear on what is a big part of our forest-based economy here in the region, tourism. Would you like to speak to that?
Sure. It certainly is real that we are seeing an impact with the strained relationship right now with our neighbors in the north. And they are reacting by not visiting, and it's real. I could speak directly to Vermont State Parks. We're just looking at our end of the season sort of numbers, and our Canadian visitation is down 60% for camping, which is about 10% of our overall camping. A lot of destinations in the region are struggling because of we've had such a neighborly relationship, and they're taking a stand right now. And we also have recreational businesses that do manufacturing right across the border that are being impacted. So the Northern Forest region, our recreation economy, is something that I think we all invest in. It's meaningful, contributes a lot, and it also is seeing impacts right now that are real. We're doing our best to say, come visit Vermont, and I'm sure other states are doing the same thing. We're just not seeing it happening.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think we'd all acknowledge the tariffs, trades. I mean, the fact that it's really hard to keep track of, right, in terms of where things are. And I mean, Dana, you spoke to this a little bit. Just stability and predictability are really important factors. Even to that huge challenge you put on the table of like growing our domestic manufacturing capacity. That also requires some sense that there's a stable path ahead of us. So that's brought a dynamism, and again, particularly because of we're right on a border, and both for visitation and the flow of products and services across it has made it feel particularly pointed here. I want to encourage our audience, if you've got questions that you've been sitting on, now is a great time to drop them into our Q&A function there. We'll come to those shortly. But final question as part of our panel discussion. We all had a good laugh when I proposed this question of like, if you were going to look out a few months, and everyone's like, forget it, Joe. Like, we're not, no, we'll not answer that question. So the question, I changed it more to like, what do you think for our audience, recognizing that things can change day by day? What do you think you'll be paying most attention to in the immediate future? That's to be defined. That could be this afternoon. It could be tomorrow, it could be next week. What will you be paying attention to? And also, what do you think our audience should be paying attention to and acting on if they're so inclined, knowing that we've got an audience here of folks across the Northern Forest who span industry interests, community interests, conservation interests, and many others. Why don't we start? I'm going to mix it up. Let me start with Steve, Danny, Dana, and then we'll go to Mandy.
Yeah, I'll start, Joe, with a point that you made about the Forest Products Lab actually is that these investments, these line items in the budget all trickle down to private lands, private work, private businesses, and I think I'd be hard pressed to point to something in our industry, in the forest industry, that has not been touched by either the Forest Service or the USDA in some fashion for good. So I would argue that these programs do good regardless of what where you fall on the spectrum here of politics. But I think these all have a place on the landscape here, and so I'm definitely watching the budgets for state, private, and tribal. That really is something that affects me pretty hard. Obviously, from the USDA perspective, the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, that's NIFA, that's out of USDA as well. That affects Extension, Smith-Lever, and Hatch Acts. Yeah, I mean, it's a long list that we described already, but really, when I think about changes that I'm really interested in is these really small ones, the relationships that we're looking to maintain or build back, essentially, just because they have been either taken away or there's been so many vacancies here in the region. So there's that, and then the Farm Bill that has big impact on the work that we do and the landowners that we work with. So just we'll see how that shakes out. I know we've met with legislators maybe a year and a half ago, as it seems like forever ago, talking about the Farm Bill, but we'll see how that shakes out.
Yeah, do you know, Steve, like I know that's always a moving target in terms of timing, but anything you've heard, or we may have folks online who want
Yes,
to drop it in the chat, but
yeah, I see people on
yeah,
the participant list that know way
yeah.
more about than I do, so I'll let them.
Yes. Okay. So if anyone on the chat wants to throw in what you know about Farm Bill timing, that would be great and welcome. What did I say next? Danny, we'll come to you.
You did. My understanding is that they're going to try and pick it up this fall on the House side using the 2024 House document, but there's a lot of work to be done on it. I don't think it'll get done before the end of the year, but it's something to be watching. I think I could echo everything that Steve said, even starting off with forest products and innovation. I think if I was to look further out, maybe there would be a recognition of wanting to make investments in our region. We have expansive forests. We maintain them really well. I'd say, we're gold star here in this region, and we need innovation and investment in the manufacturing side that could serve us well. I'll be watching budgets. I'll be watching what happens with the people, with the reorg, and I'll be looking at any other sort of structural changes in our partnerships, which matter because we help deliver the services that on the ground, and they're so important to have those relationships. And then we'll be riding the roller coaster.
For sure. Thank you, Danny. Mandy, what would you offer?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, similar, pretty much everything we've talked about today is going to, I think, continue to occupy AMC's attention for the next couple of months. And just once we get through this budget, we'll be starting to plan for the next budget cycle. But a couple of other things, on the Farm Bill, I know, Joe, you articulated well, there's a lot of conservation forestry programs, at stake in that. So we will definitely be engaged, thinking about the Forestry Conservation Easement Program as one example, if and when the Farm Bill starts to come together. Another piece of legislation, which I haven't talked about yet, is the America the Beautiful Act. This is a bipartisan piece of legislation, addresses a lot of the maintenance backlog. I think it's over 8 billion backlog estimated for Forest Service. So that's another piece of legislation that, I think is, productive, and we're hoping to see some movement on that. But in addition, it's just all the agency and administrative actions. We're just, we plan to continue our engagement. We expect more from this administration in the coming months that we'll be tracking closely.
Great. And Dana.
Yeah, I I think in the short term, I just want to see if money's put where their mouth is. And specifically I'll say, utilization of wood and increase of whether it's manufacturing or changes in federal policy like the renewable fuel standards that's going to allow recognition or utilization of low grade wood, pulpwood, pre-commercial thinnings, sawmill residuals, etc., that will qualify for RFS. So that's whether that's for biofuel or that's for electricity that's made out of wood. I think that's something we've been asking for a decade, if not longer. In fact, we had a multitude of conversations with the previous Trump administration in 2018, 2019, early 2020 about this very topic. But the ethanol lobby, the corn lobby was so powerful that they wouldn't allow the changes. So frankly, we've asked for it again. I want to see if it actually happens. And if it actually happens, I think we're actually going to see some new manufacturing that's going to start up as a result. And I think that's what everybody wants. So it'll be interesting to see if they put their money where their mouth is.
Great. Thanks, Dana. We've got a number of questions, I think, sparked by your comments about growing domestic manufacturing or, mill capacity in the region. I'm going to come to in a sec if you want to glance at those because I'm coming your direction. But one of the other questions that we've got as we start to pivot into the Q&A, I'm going to paraphrase, but just, talking about forest-related grants, ones that have been rescission, yanked back. Just the political dynamics of that, based on our geography, who our elected officials are. That's a tough question, so I'll take a stab at it to keep our panelists off the hook if they want to stay off of it. I would just say, from my perspective, as I think this conversation has highlighted, forests can and should be a pretty bipartisan issue. I think, Mandy, you spoke to this around forest legacy. I was at an event, the American Forest Congress, earlier in the summer, where there actually was a bipartisan panel, which I did not expect to. I was not expecting to be inspired, to be quite candid, by a congressional panel, but I was. It was talking about the Fix Our Forests Act, and again, Democrats and Republicans. There's a lot of common ground around forests, interest both in their conservation and their health, as well as in their stewardship and use. So it's a bit of a punt on the question in front of us, but that's the tack that we've taken at the center, is that it is important to pay attention to the language that's being used, and have programs don't respond in ways that reflect what's being asked for, because we do know we've been told as a grantee there is political review of all new grant applications. So that is part of the process now. So that is definitely a dynamic, and I guess I'm offering some optimism that this set of issues that we've been talking about is pretty bipartisan, and as Dana has said, aligns at least in concept with a lot of the priorities that this administration has outlined around forest management and forest products. The couple of questions on, I don't know if anyone else wants to speak to that, or we'll go in a different direction to Dana, your comments about the importance of that we don't have enough milling capacity currently, potential to grow that. Do you want to speak a little bit more to what it would really take to do that?
Yeah, it's a big question. I know, Joe.
Yeah.
I saw in the Q&A, what advantages do the Canadians have? I'll use that as an opportunity to compare what the United States doesn't do. So, for instance, there's a reason why the Canadians have 5 spruce fir stud mills located on the Maine border, and it's because they get their wood from Maine, and so it's a proximity to fiber. But the Canadian national government, so take a step back and look at how, regulation but development takes place in the United States. It generally comes down to the local level. And not to put poor Danny on the spot, but you've got something in Vermont called Act 250. Act 250 from a state level just really dictates that manufacturing is almost impossible to move forward in the state of Vermont. But that is a prime example of whether it's state or if it's local. Regulations in the United States dictate major developments. The Canadians have taken a different perspective. They do it at the national level. They create incentives at the national level. And so I say they've eaten our lunch, and good for them, because over the last 3 decades, 4 decades, they have invested heavily in wood products manufacturing. That's pulp and paper, that's solid wood products, and it doesn't matter if it's softwood or hardwood. Everyone that's probably on here who lives in the Northeast sees loads of logs headed to Canada almost every day. There's a reason, because they have incentives over the United States that have been built in by the national government. Because all politics is local in the United States, and you have state regulation and local regulation on top of federal regulation, it's expensive to try to build or expand manufacturing in the US. And the Canadians have effectively taken that out of the hands of localities and provinces, and they put it at the national level. They've also created incentives at the national level. And so and then they provide subsidized healthcare, they provide subsidized electricity, they provide subsidies for equipment manufacturing and investments. And so they've created really a platform that I think we should look at. Now, it's probably going to be impossible to move those forward in a short time. I saw one of the questions in the chat. How long is this going to take? It's going to take decades. But unless we get serious about it, we're going to continue to see loss of manufacturing. And lastly, I know Joe, you asked what's it going to take. I think we just frankly need consistency and leadership. I mentioned the auto industry. South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, they got serious about luring auto manufacturing from Asia. So Honda, they brought it from Europe. They brought Mercedes. All of them have looked at opportunities to manufacture in the United States, but it came with incentives. And many will argue, well, you gave away your shirt. Well, you've got a lot of people working in that industry as a result, and money is staying circulating in the economy. And I think the same thing has to happen with forest products. We have lost that reality check. So that's enough for now.
Thanks, Dana. Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of the Northern Forest Center does some work in housing, and that feels sort of similar. There, it can be one thing to say from the top, well, we need more housing, but then there's layers of, down to the individual community level, plus markets on top of that just make that kind of systems change really very, very challenging. And as you say, without that kind of consistent leadership over time, and as some of those just structural differences, it can be hard to contemplate. And it's required, though, I think, to get to some of the end games that we've been talking about. There's another great question in our Q&A from Anne. I'll just read it. Private philanthropy can't replace federal dollars for functions like long-term research or massive federal grant programs. But let's assume we're in a new normal and the federal government will not be investing the way it has in the past in ecosystem resilience, climate-related activities in our forests. The question for the panel is what might you be thinking about who or how or where investments can be made by private philanthropy or by the private sector that would help ensure research, science-based decision-making, and critical functions that maybe have been coming from federal agencies, and are there any alternatives? Anyone like to take a stab at that?
A quick stab. I hope it's not the new normal for research, science-based decision making. We benefit from that long-term investment, and we need that. Luckily, there's three branches, and Congress seems to be listening here and values the research end of it. So I think we still need to be continuing to share the concerns on any cuts on the impacts, and hopefully we're not going to see devastating cuts to these areas. I mean, we could see some reorganization, hopefully not, but there's a comment period now. Things are starting to shift, I do hope. You also can be looking at state resources, which, I mean, I'm talking from Vermont, we're pretty limited right now, but it's all about partnerships too. And there's a lot of people that care out there. So bring people together. I will just follow up on what Dana said about Act 250 in Vermont. I am happy to report that we have a wood products manufacturing report that looks like reducing regulations for that industry. Let's see what kind of success we have at the State House this year.
Great. Thanks, Danny. Mandy, anything from your perspective on the role of philanthropy?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with Anne's premise that private philanthropy is not going to make up for the federal government's investment, and also the convening and partnership and leadership role that they have. We can't replace that. That's why AMC is going to still really be focused on the federal appropriations, educating our entire congressional delegation and working with them to promote the programs that we've identified as critical. We're also going to be working at the state level, but the state's not going to be able to make up that capacity either. And I think state budgets are going to be increasingly challenged over the next year because our issue doesn't exist in a vacuum. There's a lot of other financial burdens and challenges that are just going to manifest. For AMC, just looking, thinking very small in our organization. I mean, we have a group who's doing research, and they've been doing long-term monitoring projects, and those are the types we really don't want interruption. Those part of the value of those is you have that continuous analysis and going on that you're using to educate decision makers and inform our own management of our resources. So yeah, it's a challenge. I share Danny's hope this is hopefully not the new normal. I mean, we have seen some of those glimmers of success in educating decision makers who have been putting in the budget that they want to see for research and investment. But I think this is just going to be a continual area of discussion with our leaders.
Great.
Yeah, I agree with all that, and I think at least with UNH Extension and our work in Forestry and Wildlife, we've really started to focus on just the core work that we do, and that's the education of landowners and the professionals who work with those landowners, based on the cuts from the federal, state, and at the university level as well. We're kind of getting it all around, but by doing that, we're able to just really kind of focus on what we do best. And we've been able to take advantage of private funds to start some pilot programs and do some small things, and that allows us to pull partners together to pay for some of the costs and get some new programs up and running. But it certainly does not replace the power of large grants or large funding that comes from the government. So.
Yeah, that's for certain. And Steve, you mentioned universities, and I know we had some folks from universities in our audience. And I mean, that is another place where funding reductions have been very significant. And as you touched on, I mean, research science, like fundamental science, it's hard. There are not a lot of sources for it, aside from public funding. But to the question in front of us, that may suggest or force some different paradigms in terms of R&D, in terms of partnerships with philanthropy, partnerships with industry. We are very close to our endpoint. I know this has been a really full hour and a half. My brain is swimming, but I want to begin to wrap us up. And first, with a huge thank you to our panelists, Steve, Dana, Danny, Mandy. Thank you for being part of this, for sharing what you know. Thanks to our audience for hanging in there. Want to again thank my colleague Kendall, who will be following up with an email that will include the link to a recording of this webinar, resources. We'll also try to include in that some links to some of the, Kendall already put some of them in the chat, but to relevant websites, places where you can learn more about some of the issues that we've talked about, or follow up and do your own follow up on some of these topics. I think if nothing, hopefully this conversation has illustrated this is a really important time to be paying attention. I know we all have a lot, probably too much to be paying attention to, but I want to come back to Dana's comment that attention on forests and forest policy, whether you like it or not, does create an opportunity to get into the conversation and raise up, as today's conversation has. These are why forests matter. These are why the people who think about and research and steward and work in forests and produce products from them. It's why they're important. And it's an opportunity to get our ideas and the importance of those issues into the mix. This is a regular series, as I noted at the top. Kendall's got up a sampling of past webinars. If you're interested in the next one, please make sure you're on our biweekly Northern Forest News Digest email newsletter. Kendall puts this together every 2 weeks with a selection of news from across the Northern Forest. That's how we'll update you on our next webinar. And with that, I again want to say thank you all very much. Thank you to our audience. And I wish everyone a great afternoon in or near the Northern Forest. Thanks, everybody.